So at Indiana University, my center does software development and also data service development in the area of science studies, so studying science by scientific means. Many of these algorithms, these data mining and visualization algorithms, can also be applied for in other domains, in the biomedical domain, so we have collaborations there. In the financial domain, we are working with hedge funds and others which have also massive amounts of data, and they are interested to make sense of it to, in their case, make more money. In the case of biomedical collaborations, I think the ambition is much higher. It's to save lives. It's to have parents go home with their child and not without their children. However, what is needed in today's time and age, as you might have discovered over the last days and also prior to this, is to make sense of this massive amount of data, information, knowledge, expertise, and ideally also wisdom. And oftentimes you want to find your way, you want to find collaborators and friends, identify enemies, keep track of them, and also identify trends over time. And so this black box that's in between somebody who has a lot of data, ideally digitized, and making sense of it and using it effectively in your decision making is really what these tools, what these computers can give us. And in particular, we are interested in developing descriptive models that can be used to analyze a data set, and also predictive models that can show us a little bit about the future, that can predict forward in time. Let me start with descriptive models, and obviously now that I have shown you the movie, I'm kind of already out of time. So I'm going to only show you a few of those, but there's a lot more online to read if you're interested in. In our world, we oftentimes have to look at a system holistically from the micro level to the macro level. For instance, if you look at career decision making, somebody going into engineering like myself, studying electrical engineering and going to computer science, now working with domain experts from many different areas of research, that is very much an individual level decision. However, it's impacted by whatever funding is in place, whatever value systems a certain society has, whatever positions are available, etc. And so there is always this interplay between those different levels. If you have these different levels, you can see them as columns in a table such as this. And oftentimes then the rows of this table make up the different types of questions you might have. So obviously there are simple statistical analysis which you can do, but then there are also temporal when questions. There are geospatial questions that help you answer where questions. There are topical analysis algorithms that more and more help you to understand what people are doing, what they're researching, for instance. And network analysis helps you understand with whom questions that oftentimes require representing your world in a completely different way, namely as a network or as a tree. And so if you have this grid of different levels of analysis by different types of analysis, you can then start to fill this in with the types of analysis you're doing. And actually having this grid in mind is important because if you have a very small scale data set at the micro level, sometimes you can do it by hand. And there are many, many tools which can do this. If you're at the macro scale, more than 100,000 records, or maybe 1 million or 10 million or even 1 billion records, you better have good computing infrastructures and you have algorithms that scale. So that by itself helps you to determine what kind of tools are really useful for you for that moment. Similarly, if you have statistical analysis, there are lots of different statistical packages out there, most of which are freely available. So you can just go and use those. However, for temporal analysis, geospatial, you would obviously go to a geographer, cartographer. Topical analysis, you would go to a linguist. Computer scientists, there are many which are doing really good algorithm design there. Network analysis, there are many, many social scientists and recently also physicists, but also biologists and others developing really neat algorithms to do backbone identification, to do clustering, to deal with very, very large-scale networks. And so again, I think having that table really helps you to identify what kind of algorithms to use. Again, I have very little time here left, so I'm going to show you some analysis we did. One was a very neat collaboration with the National Cancer Center at the National Institutes of Health, and they had a deep interest to understand how different types of funding result in very different outcomes in terms of scientific results, but also in terms of scientific collaboration networks. And so they compiled two data sets. One is a data set of all the TTURC centers, the tobacco research centers they had funded, 8 of them over over a decade of time. And then they had also compiled another data set which had R01 investigator-initiated research funded over the same time span in the same topic area. So you now have two data sets. One is big center funding, and the other one individual funding given to individual investigators. And the big question is, which one is more efficient in terms of, for instance, in terms of number of papers or number of citations per dollar amount spent? And as you might imagine, the big centers, they have all kinds of purposes, including doing software development, infrastructure development, doing a lot of education for postdocs, doing lots of workshops, etc. So they are not as efficient because they spend their money also on a lot of management. If you have a big center to manage, so you spend your time on that. So in the top right, you kind of see the dollar amount spent per paper in this particular case, but you could similarly do this also for each citation. Down here, you see on the left-hand side the co-authorship networks that evolved from the R01 investigator-initiated research funding, and on the right-hand side, the collaboration networks that come from funding centers. And this is possible because NSF now links the projects with publications. So you can do these return on investment studies. So basically you take all the funding that was provided, you get all the corresponding papers, and then you start doing your normal analysis of co-authorship networks in this particular case. So you could argue if you would like to have a deeply or very intensely connected co-authorship network, you need to fund centers. But it would be interesting to see what happens if you invite all these investigators to a workshop where they present each other's work to each other. So that could be resulting in a very different structure. So I think these investigations now become possible not only for collaboration networks, but also for the spreading of ideas over geospatial space, but also over topical spaces, over maps of science. And actually the forthcoming publication here also has information on how quickly information and knowledge ultimately spreads over the landscape of science if you do one type of funding or the other type of funding. In another project, this is actually back in time in 2006, so 8 years ago, we looked at the impact of the internet, the introduction of the internet to our scholarly world on the diffusion of knowledge, and here specifically on the citation behavior of researchers. So we thought if the internet now comes into existence, that people would cite over longer and longer distances. So you have here the log of the number of institutions citing each other over the log of the geographic distance. And I would have assumed that as the internet becomes more widespread and more widespread used, the curve would become longer, would become flatter, basically. It turns out that for this particular data set, which is 20 years of PNAS publications, mostly biomedical research, it becomes actually steeper and steeper, and we were puzzled by this. And so I asked some of my colleagues, Howard White and Barry Wellman, they're scientometrician, social scientists, and they had just done a different study, they're very different data set with a very similar result. And they had concluded that as you are bombarded with more and more information, just like you saw it in the movie, your social networks actually become more and more important for deciding what to read, what to cite, what is important in your scientific life, maybe also in your private life. And so social networks obviously are much easier to create and maintain in a locally face-to-face environment. And so that could be one reason. Another reason could be that you very well keep in mind whom you are going to face again in the hallway or at the coffee machine. And that might impact whom you're citing in these few slots you have at the end of the paper. Ultimately, it might be a combination, and I would love to see this replicated for other data sets. And given some of the tools we now have available, that's actually a very easy replication to do. We were interested to not only see this for the US, but also worldwide. And so I spent a month a few years ago in Dirk Helbing's team. That was just around the time when he was leading the effort to create an innovation accelerator for Europe, or at least to put in the proposal for that. And some of you might have been involved in this effort. And he had access to the Thomson Reuters data. This is the data that covers 1900s to today, all the publication data. And we were interested to see if China, in addition to very soon taking over the lead in the number of papers produced, also China is going to very soon taking over the lead in the number of citations received by any one country. If it also has a very dominant role in terms of being a source of knowledge. And so thanks to the physics skills of Dirk Helbing's team, we identified and defined sources and sinks of knowledge. And then using knowledge flows, citation linkage flows, between 2000 and 2009, we tried to identify global sources and sinks of knowledge production. And it looks that even though the citation counts and the number of publication counts are going up, Asia is still very much dependent on what's happening in Europe and in Asia. And you can also visualize this in different ways. Look at the number of citations given away or done to other research teams and places around the globe. And you could, of course, also overlay these kind of knowledge diffusion flows over the maps of science. So you would get to see how the different areas and continents of science, if you wish, are citing each other. So again, if you would like to know details on this, please go and do the readings. In that table, you might have expect to see one more question. Is anyone missing a question in this table? So, good. All right. 1 point there. And so this is really getting over to predictive modeling. So trying to figure out, why do we have the structures we have? Why is there a burst of activity? Why do we see these trends? Why is that research area emerging? Why do people take that career path? And again, I have only little time here, so I will show you one model which was actually done in collaboration with a bunch of colleagues I have at Indiana University, all of which do really interesting work. Johan Borlen was the lead here, David Crandall and Young and Jing Ding. Some of you actually might know all of us. And this particular piece of work is interesting because many of us, especially right now when funding resources are very scarce, we are spending a lot of time writing grant proposals. And the question is, could there be a more efficient system in distributing funding? And so here on the left-hand side, you have the current system. So Congress awards some amount of money to different funding agencies. Of course, that requires that funding agencies lobby strongly for the value of research, value also of research in the social sciences, etc. You might have seen the recent discussions there. Then these funding agencies put out solicitations. Researchers like myself, we respond to those. We try to make sure that the funding agency sees that we have been doing this for decades and we are the world leading experts on this, and we also want this new project idea funded. Then many of us spend a lot more time reviewing all of this, and very, very few get actually the funding. Another model, which could also be introduced in parallel to the current model, is that Congress allocates a certain dollar amount, and then each one of us basically gets the same amount, or, and I will go into details there, in the beginning you might receive the same amount, but then we have to give away part of that funding. Basically, every single researcher becomes his or her own funding agency. This would obviously cut out funding agencies, and I think they have a very important role to play, especially also for lobbying to Congress, also for identifying new areas and doing some top-down nudging of where researchers might like to go. But again, it could be implemented in parallel. So let's see why we want this. And this is a back of the napkin calculation. So in the US, it's actually very well known how much a computer science professor earns. So you can go to the Torby survey of salaries in computer science, and you can do this right now and figure out how much you would make if you go into computer science and are an assistant, associate, or full professor at a certain university. So if you assume that 4 professors work 4 weeks full-time on a proposal, and I think if this is a new proposal and it's a more interesting proposal, then that's pretty much correct. Then the labor costs are about $30,000. If the funding rate is below 20%, then about 5 submissions are necessary. So if you do 5 times 30K, it's 150K. And maybe the resubmissions don't take as much time, but maybe you actually add on substantially. So I think this is actually a good calculation. The average NSF grant is $128,000 per year. So you can just take the total amount of all NSF. All this data is publicly available in the US. So you can make these calculations. Then of those $128,000 per year, US universities actually get so-called indirect costs or overhead, which is 50%, in this case, circa $42,000. So you have $86,000 left after you get the grant. However, you already spent $150,000 in order to submit that thing 5 times, basically leaving you a minus of $64,000 in year 1. And so every single university should actually forbid researchers to engage in this kind of wasteful behavior. And of course, you could argue, well, a typical grant has actually 3 years, so you make a little bit of plus, but it's very, very expensive. And this is not involving any of the time I spent reviewing grants or or supervising others which are interested in writing grants. So there's a lot more than just what is shown here. Okay, so let's see how this new model might work. So again, here, if the total funding per year is TY, and the number of qualified scientists is N, and so you could just use the normal qualification criteria which NSF currently has in place, then you would basically each year deposit TY divided by N in each researcher's budget account. So let's say, and I have a more concrete example on the next slide. And then you can decide how much of this money each scientist has to give away. So obviously, if they don't have to give anything away, everybody is very egalitarian. Everybody has the same amount of money to spend in that year. And I think some countries actually do it this way. They have this water can model. Everybody gets a little bit. And I think it's not clear yet what system actually has what kind of results. However, if you require them to give away 100% of what they just got, then many people will end up with nothing, whereas there will be some rich get richer people which get quite a bit. And I bet you would actually get a scale-free distribution for this again. So in order to fund rank scientists this way, scientists actually have to communicate to each other what they are doing, which is a very nice side effect of such a model. They have to also communicate to each other what they would be doing if they would have $1 million. And currently they don't have any incentive to do this besides putting this into proposals. So there are a number of really interesting other benefits that this model would have. But now let's become very, very concrete. So if we assume that the average amount for each scientist each year is 100,000, the fraction is set to 50 So everybody has to give away 50% of their money. Then in 2013, a scientist like me would receive a basic grant of $100,000. And let's say I'm lucky, so other people believe I do good stuff. So they give me 200,000. Maybe that's from 200 people. Maybe that's just from 4 people. I don't know that. And I will never know, by the way, who gave me that money. It could be made transparent, but maybe it's not. So I think that's another good question to ask about that model, how to best set it up. And so I would basically have a total amount of 300,000. And then in that year, in 2013, I can spend those, spend 50% of it, and 150,000, half of it, I have to give away for somebody else, or many of my colleagues, in the next year to spend. So rather than submitting and reviewing all these many grant proposals, all I do is to log into an online system and give away those $150,000. Much faster. So you could argue, well, and how far does this model do anything like what we see in the current data? So if you are interested to look at the model or advance it, all of this is written up in a paper on xArchive. The EMBO reports only wanted to publish the kind of science policy relevant bits. They didn't want the model itself, unfortunately. So in the model, you will see that citations are used as a proxy to understand how researchers might go about distributing their money. And so we took Thomson Reuters Web of Science data from 92 to 2010. So 73 million articles with 770 million citations and 4+ million unique author names. And then those 800,000 plus authors which had authored at least one paper in a 5-year period, they were used in the validation. And we basically matched those authors with the PIs of NSF NIH funding, which we have in the scholarly database, which is an open free database. And so that's a very crude matching of author names, because John Smith is going to be an obvious problem. However, if you do it this way, then you get actually 109,000 unique scientists, which have quite a large number of interlinkages with each other. And then the simulation run begins in 2000, in which each scientist gets a fixed budget of 100K. And then in subsequent years, science distributes their funding in proportion to their citations over the coming 5 years. So we are not arguing that the funding should be given out according to the citations that people make to each other. All we did here is to use citations as a proxy to understand how they might allocate their funding. So that's very important to understand. And if you do this, then you actually get very, very similar patterns to how NSF and NIH money is distributed right now. So again, if you're interested, please look at the full. And of course, that made quite a number of waves, and it's still making waves. And I just recently presented this to the European Commission, and they didn't like that at all. They had all kinds of questions about it. But I think it's a good thought experiment of how to set something like this up. And it was interesting for me that you really get a very similar distribution of money if you use them. Okay, how many more minutes do I have left? 5. Okay, I can do this. So hold your questions still. One piece I want to do is to tell you that what you see outside are maps of science, 70 of 100 now. You, however, only get to see these small versions, the plotted poster versions. The real maps are much larger. They're beautiful. They come on archival paper and archival ink. If you ever have an anniversary for your university or company, etc., or if you just have a hallway which you would like to have a nice image in, feel free to let us know, and we are always happy to help you bring science maps to your walls. Many of these maps out there actually show you collaboration and communication patterns. So these are scientific collaborations out of the Elsevier data. And you have seen the Facebook map, and it's interesting to see in how far Facebook interlinkages correspond or do not correspond to scientific linkages. You saw Twitter usage. This is a map of Twitter languages across Europe. And you see the Netherlands are extremely active. Not sure about the choice of gray for English, but that's what Eric did here. And maybe it makes it less dominant, but I think it's all right. You see that there are the urban areas which are especially active. You see all the major highway systems. People are tweeting while driving, maybe, or maybe they have a lot of passengers. And you can do this worldwide now. You have Johan Bollen and his team's map of how people use science. Not how science cites each other, but how people use science in doctors' offices, in many places where people do not necessarily publish, but they're still using the scientific results. And ultimately, I think what you want is to look at the feedback cycles in science. Positive ones, where somebody gets a great position with a lot of startup and uses that money wisely to hire good postdocs, have a lot of good results, and from there have much better chances of getting the next round of funding. But also many negative feedback cycles in science for all kinds of reasons. I think you want to understand those feedback cycles, and that's also why modeling is so important. In many cases, you want to interact with science. You want to type in your name. You want to type in your name and see where you are on the landscape of science geospatially, but also in the topical realm. And we have displays which allow you to do so. And you could feed your own data if you have data in your country's language. Many of these maps and many of these interactive interfaces are still in English. And I think there's a lot more research done, good research done, which is not written up in English. The maps and also the interactive displays travel well in trains. So if you have a train station, this is a great way to bring a lot of science to a lot of people very quickly. We now also have them as big screensavers. So if you have one of those big tiled walls and you don't have enough material, let us know. We are always happy to provide visuals. And I think the map really opened people's minds and hearts for the beauty and also complexity and value of science. And we need this in today's time and age where budgets are very, very short. So feel free to go online. All these maps, you can zoom in and see all the details. You don't have to live with the little thumbnails here. I wanted to leave you with the understanding that any one of you can now map. There are now tools available that are easy to use for anyone, not only high school students and congressmen, but really anyone. And I think it's important that all of us embrace these new tools because they help us make sense of all that data. So I've been teaching the Information Visualization MOOC, and we have students from 100+ countries in there. In the first year, we had 350 faculty members, and the second year, even more. And it's scary because I typically don't have other faculty members see what I'm doing in class. But I think it's a great way to learn from each other what works in such an environment and what doesn't work. We have 7 sessions, and they are very much organized according to the table you just saw, prefaced with a workflow design and visualization framework unit. And then the very last one also shows you more about interactivity and how to deploy things online. And you can get a letter of accomplishment or a Mozilla badge for your LinkedIn page. Or IU now also has a data science certificate, so you can actually get IU credits if you like. The visualization framework, which we are using in the course, is easy because it has to be simple. It has to be 1, 2, 3, read the data, analyze the data, visualize the data. But then visualization, of course, is a very complex process because depending on your input device and depending on your reference system and depending on your data density and depending on what you actually want to analyze and visualize, this all interacts with each other. And that's what makes it so hard to do a good visualization. And I think you will see this in the subsequent presentations as well. But you can then go through different reference systems from simple, just 2 axes, to geospatial maps, here a map of the US, to topical spaces, to science maps, etc. And it's always select a reference system, overlay the data to see density patterns, and then do all kinds of visual encodings, color coding, size coding, thickness coding, etc. Also have clients. So if you want a lot of students to work on your projects for free, you can always become a client in this MOOC. And basically, you have to have a data set, you have to have a good question, or hypothesis or practical need, and you have to have 4 hours of your time, because you will have to review and do a thumbs up, thumbs down, and some quotes for the final results. And some projects attract as many as 5 teams, are 5 students, so you basically have 25 students work for you, and you can see in how far these tools do something for your question. And some PhD students have been very smart, and they were really extremely good clients, and there have been quite a number of publications and online websites and project results coming out from these client projects. And for the students, it's a wonderful way to have another portfolio item. So these are some visualizations that students did in the course to give you a nice idea of what they do. All right, so that is the end of my presentation. I have some handouts for those of you which try the MOOC or want to consider becoming clients. So if you can distribute that, that would be wonderful. And I'm available for questions if there are any. Thank you.